All right, great. Well, thank you for having me here today. It's great to be part of this new event, the Future Data-Driven Summit 2021. Looking forward to hearing back from you, getting feedback from you on all the stuff that that you want to learn about. So just kind of to tell you what this session is about, we're going to talk about what is Azure SQL Managed Instance. And if you were here for Bob Ward's presentation right before me, he covered a lot of material. Some of it covered managed instance as well. So we're going to go just a little bit deeper on that. So just real quick, a little information about me. I'm a senior cloud solution architect in the data and AI space in the manufacturing vertical at Microsoft. And before joining Microsoft, I was a data platform MVP for many years. I was very involved with PaaS, and I'm so sad that it disappeared earlier this year. But I still look forward to doing events like this and SQL Saturdays and things like that. So hopefully we'll get back to the in-person events and we can have a great time together. So what we're going to do is kind of you can either open a new browser window or use your phone and scan that QR code. Go to menti.com and just want to kind of see what the who is out here in our audience today. So go ahead and you should be able to go there and start putting in what your role is. Are you a DBA? All right, we have a DBA. Do we have any developers or consultants or management types? Another DBA, good. DBA, developer. There's more of you out there, aren't there? Just looking at this, and I'll probably will go, oh, another DBA. Data engineer, very good. Do we have any architects out here? Right. I'm going to keep this another data engineer. Great. I'm going to keep this open. I'll probably come back to this in just a little bit, and also we'll have another interaction for you in just a little while during the presentation. So let me go back to my slides. All right, so basically let's talk about, at a very high level, so if someone says, hey, what is managed instance? Very high level, it's a new way to run SQL Server in Azure, or actually it's a couple years old now, so it's not a brand new way, but it is another way to run SQL Server in Azure. It's a Microsoft managed cloud native service, so we manage stuff for you, and it's built on the Azure SQL Database architecture. So if you've been running or playing with Azure SQL Database, it's the same architecture, just kind of put together a little bit differently. And it has a lot more compatibility with SQL Server so that whatever you've been used to running on-prem, it's very close compatibility to that. And it's basically an evergreen version or a versionless version of SQL. It's continuously improved, so it always is the latest bits of SQL Server. So even if you have SQL Server 2019 running, it has later bits than that running in here. And the primary goal of managed instance was basically to have a frictionless or a very low friction migration pathway to Azure. So that's very easy to get from on-prem into a managed instance because it's such close compatibility with SQL Server. Now some key features. Well, it's a PaaS service, so that means has built-in high availability. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. You can scale up, scale down. Compute and storage are separated. And without going into the other list of key features there, and actually, if you look at those key features, a lot of those were things that were keeping people from moving to Azure SQL Database. So basically it's saying, hey, we can actually break down those blockers and help you get into Azure much more quickly. So a couple things I want you to remember during this session is that Managed Instance is a PaaS offering. We're going to go over a little bit about what PaaS is in just a second, but essentially, for exchange for built-in high availability, we do the backups for you, we do the patching for you, some other things as well. There are some things that are no longer in your control because we have a financially backed SLA to maintain, and if we don't control certain things of it, we cannot guarantee that availability. The other thing to remember is that some things are different in the cloud, not necessarily better or worse, it's just different in the way that you can allocate resources and be responsible for them, etc. So there's a few little differences, not they're better or worse, it's just different. And if it can't be changed, then understanding the architecture and seeing if there's some way to work around it may help you in adopting this platform. And the last thing to remember is that SQL Server under the covers. In other words, all the stuff that you know about SQL Server that you've done with t-sql commands and DMVs and X events and stuff like that pretty much apply to this platform as well. So you're not starting from ground zero. You already have a wealth of knowledge that you can apply when you move to Managed Instance. So when we talk about moving your SQL Server workloads to Azure, there are three main ways that we're going to focus on here, and primarily the middle one here called Managed Instance. But the other ones are Azure SQL Database and Elastic Pools. They're same family, if you will. And also SQL Server on Azure VM. We're going to touch upon that, which is IaaS. And there's two other things that you may say, hey, isn't that SQL Server as well? And it is, but I'm just going to mention them here. We're not going to talk about them the rest of the session. And that is Azure Synapse Analytics, the dedicated SQL pools. It's basically another way you can run SQL Server in the cloud. But again, we're not going to talk about that. Or if you've heard of SQL DW, that's kind of SQL Server as well. And the other thing is actually what Bob Ward mentioned at the end of his presentation right before mine was you can actually run Managed Instance on an Arc-enabled environment. And other than telling you about it right now and say we're not going to discuss that in this session, by the way, it's really cool, by the way, but we're just not going to talk about it here in this session at this time. So if you don't know what PaaS is, and this is a great graphic to kind of get your head around what that means. So if you go from, let me say, pizza as a service, PaaS, right? Platform as a service, but we're going to go through the as a service things. Basically, if you make a pizza at home, then you're responsible for making the pizza dough, the sauce, the toppings, what type of cheese goes on it. You bake it in the oven. You provide the infrastructure, if you will, for your table and chairs so you can sit down and enjoy it, and of course your drink. So that's kind of make it home type of thing. So that's like on-prem, right? You're doing everything yourself. If you complain about anything, hey, it's your fault because you made it, right? You're responsible for all that. The next level up, if you will, take and bake, which is kind of like infrastructure as a service. Hey, we provide the pizza dough, the sauce, the toppings, the cheese. It's already made up. All you need to do is provide the oven and the heat to bake it, and basically the table and chairs to enjoy it, and of course your drink, and you're ready to go. And then there's PaaS, Platform as a Service, which is kind of like pizza delivery. Basically, we're taking care of everything for you. You just need to, except for the table and chairs and your drink. We're providing the dough, the cheese, the toppings. We bake it for you, etc. So that's PaaS. And then software as a service, which we're really not going to focus on here in this session, is similar to going out and dining out for pizza, where basically you go to a restaurant, they provide the chairs, the table, the drink, they cook it for you. You can also be very precise on what toppings you want, and maybe just buy enough of like a slice or two of pizza that will satisfy you, because maybe you don't want to overbuy. So hopefully this helps you understand some of the benefits you have when you go to Platform as a Service versus being on-prem. And so here is kind of the stack, if you will, of services that we see going from left to right. The provider is responsible for a lot more things in that stack as you move to the right. So if you're currently on-prem, you're responsible for a lot of things, right? As you move right, your responsibility decreases. So mainly when people think about moving SQL Server workloads to the cloud, they end up going, well, IaaS is very similar to what I'm used to. PaaS is a little bit different. Let's talk a little bit about some of the differentiators between these. So for IaaS, it's version specific. You choose a particular version of SQL Server to install on top of the OS, on top of the VM that we are providing for you. So that means that you're responsible for the patching and the upgrading and the high availability and the disaster recovery and the backups, okay? So you're responsible for all that. One of the other things you can do with IaaS you can't do with PaaS, at least at this point, is turn it off. I cannot turn off the server. I mean, I can turn off the server to save money because I'm not using it. I'm still paying for storage, but I can turn it off like overnight from my dev system so I can save money there. I can also scale up and scale down with some downtime. In my experience, has been around 15 minutes of downtime to resize to a different size VM. So you have a benefit there. But also another thing I want to mention is in Azure, not in the other public clouds, but in Azure, we have something called the IaaS extension agent, which you can install inside your IaaS box. So you still have complete control over it, but you can have the agent help you with some PaaS-like features for managing backups and also doing critical patching of SQL and the OS for you. And you can actually specify a particular maintenance window that you want to have that occur by. So it's a little bit of extra PaaS features in there when you install the IaaS extension agent. So check that out if you're not familiar with it. In PaaS, it's the latest bits of SQL Server. So it's a versionless, evergreen flavor of SQL Server. So you can always take advantage of the latest and greatest advancements in SQL Server processing. And we're responsible for the patching. You are also responsible for the backups. By default, we set it to 7 days, but you can go out as far as 35 days to get that point-in-time restore type of backups that we're doing all that work for you. Also, what you can do is leverage these point-in-time restore backups for long-term retention out to 10 years at various different degrees, weekly, monthly, yearly, whatever. So we take that chore out of the way for you. And HA is part of the deal. Because we have a service level agreement, we have high availability baked in. And also DR is very easily configurable so that you can, so if something bad happens in the data center, you have another region you can fill over to. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And you can scale up and scale down. And a little caveat here, it does take some time for the actual stuff to happen behind the scenes, but the connectivity that the connectivity break that you have whenever you're doing a scale up down process with MI is a blip of connectivity interruption. So often applications don't even realize what's going on there. So that is, we're going to take a little brief break here. So James, are there any questions in the chat that I can answer?
Yes. So Rick, there's basically a comment. Dipankar just want to be friendly. He mentioned he was leading a Toronto PaaS, and smiley face. So there's a question from Kiran. So she is wondering, does the management instance have automated tuning like Azure?
Okay, so there is, so in Azure SQL Database, which is another PaaS service, but it's just the database specific scope, it does have automated tuning as far as adding and dropping indexes is concerned. That is not in managed instance at this time. So that's not there. But is there another question?
No, that was it.
Okay, great. So I hope that everyone has had kind of understands some of the differences and some of the benefits you get from PaaS service and how it's different from IaaS. And just I'm not going to go through every single one of these items here on this slide here, but just to call a couple things out that's different in managed instance that you don't have in Azure SQL databases. For example, SQL agent. You don't have SQL agent in Azure SQL database. And the scope, if you will, of this is an instance and not a database. So that is something different. I have a graphic to kind of show you what that kind of looks like. We have instance level auditing and threat detection. One other thing I want to point out, it is also compatible all the way back to SQL Server 2008. So you can take a 2008 database, a backup from a SQL Server 2008 database, and restore that into managed instance. And as long as all the compatibility stuff checks out, it will still run like it's 2008. So that's kind of cool as well. And one other limitation I want to point out here, and they're doing some work behind the scenes to see if they can improve this, is currently they have a limit of 100 databases per managed instance. So if you have more than 100 databases on your instance on-prem and you want to bring it to MI, you may need to break that out across multiple managed instances. So, I kind of like to think of, the three bears, Goldilocks and the three bears, right? And we think about, hey, this one's too hot, this one's too cold, and this one's just right. And that's kind of what I think about managed instance a lot of the time for a lot of workloads that we see out there. And that is, so in this little graphic here, on the left-hand side is SQL Server Management Studio Object Explorer of a SQL Server running on Azure VM, and it's just like running it on-prem, where you see everything that you can do with SQL Server, okay? And on the far right-hand side, you'll see SQL Server Management Studio Object Explorer with basically what you would see if you're running Azure SQL databases. You have a virtual server and you have your Azure SQL databases listed there. They can't do cross database queries, by the way, because even though they're in the same virtual server, they can't do that. And you see security. So basically, for Azure SQL database, that is your surface area. And for managed instance, it's right in the middle here, the Goldilocks thing, right? And that is, it has a lot of stuff exposed, so you can have cross-database queries. You have a little bit more in the security arena. You can, they just started doing some stuff with Polybase, et cetera, now that wasn't available before, that you can start reaching out with Polybase. You can do, so there's so many things you can do more so with managed instance that's still a PaaS offering than you can with Azure SQL Database. Now, Azure SQL Database has some great things some features that managed instance doesn't have as well. But when I think about general workloads, moving them to Azure, managed instance is definitely the place that I think makes the most sense. So I want to talk about tiers and high availability. So before I go into this, when I say there's two tiers for managed instance, the compute is exactly the same. In other words, business critical isn't any more powerful. So if a 16-core business critical instance, it's no more powerful than a 16-core general purpose box. So from a compute point of view, they're exactly the same. From a SQL Server feature point of view, you go, oh, well, it's kind of like standard in enterprise. No, not here in managed instance. Basically, the feature set is exactly the same except for one thing, and I'll point that out in just a minute. So whatever you can do in general purpose, you can do in business critical. So let's talk about business critical. So in the left-hand corner, you'll see a graphic. And what I have here is a little instance with a P on it. That means that's my primary. and that is connected to a premium storage account. And also I have another instance with an F on it. I cannot see that. Okay, it is there running all the time, waiting for something bad to happen or patching to occur or whatever to take over the compute of it. And it's very similar to a failover cluster instance, insofar that you have that shared storage in the middle. By the way, all storage in Azure is typically redundantly stored, so it isn't like a disk goes bad and all heck breaks loose, right? So yes, it's a shared storage, but it is triple redundant there. So when we do have a failover, it takes about a minute because it goes through the normal crash recovery thing, just like a failover cluster instance. And that premium storage account, which is all SSD, by the way, but it's network attached storage, so it isn't as fast as local SSD. By the way, general purpose has a little bit of local SSDs basically there for temp DB, so that part is taken care of for you. Currently, it's the limit for the storage account for general purpose is 8 terabytes. I believe it's in public preview right now. That is going up to 16 terabytes. Okay, so if that storage number is concerning to you, that's being doubled currently as we speak. So that is general purpose. Think of it as a failover cluster instance. Still fast storage, has local SSD for TempDB, so very similar to how probably a lot of your systems are set up back home. Business critical tier. This is very similar and actually uses always on availability groups underneath the covers for this. And so on the bottom right hand corner, you'll see a graphic where you have an instance with a P on it, and it has a little green dot on there. That means that is the guy that's getting all the writes and of course can do reads. And also with this, you get 2 failover instances that you don't see, but they're there. Okay, they're there purely for failover. And by the way, they're synchronous. All 3 of the replicas you see, and of course the primary, are synchronous up here. And then we get an R instance as well, a readable scale out instance as well, so you can offload some of your reads to that other node. And it's all local SSDs. The current size limitation of these SSDs is 4 terabytes. So say, well, business critical is smaller than general purpose. Yes, it is. Currently, they're working on upgrading that as well. So that hopefully will be changing in the future. And because it's all local super fast SSDs, the IOPS is going to be much better. The throughput is going to be much better. And this will enable that one feature that is not available in general purpose. And that is for in-memory LTP tables. So if you have in-memory LTP tables in your current database and application, then business critical tier is going to be where you need to hang out. So, and I mentioned that, hey, SQL Database has some features not available in MI, and as you can see, I've crossed out some of these as time has gone on. I've had this deck around for a couple years, and I'm just not going to go in depth on this one, but notice that if you see something that says, hey, this would be great to have in managed instance, odds are that they're probably working on convergence of these features. So just because it's available in one type of way you can run a SQL Server in the cloud doesn't mean that it will always be that way. As time goes on, things shift. And this is one of the slides I pull out saying, hey, yes, there are blockers out there, but there are things being eliminated from those blockers for either getting to SQL Database or a managed instance. And as you can see, over time, we're crossing these things out. There are certain things that I think that are probably never going to be in Azure SQL Database just because of the way it's scoped, right? It's a database scope, not instance scope. Same thing for managed instance. Anything that has to do with accessing the operating system or the file system probably is not going to change over time. So we'll checkpoint here. I'm going to ask James to look for questions here as well, but kind of just as where we are right here as a summary, managed instance is a great story for customers who want to take advantage of those PaaS features, the built-in HA with easy configuration for DR. Patching responsibility belongs to Microsoft. We have backups for you, point-in-time recovery backups for up to 35 days. You can leverage those backups for long-term retention. You can scale up, scale down. You have the latest SQL Server features. So it's a great place to end up at whenever you come to Azure. So, James, any questions that I can answer at this point?
Rick, there's no burning questions, but there is some links for the raffle draw for folks that are interested, and there are some event sponsors website listed in the chat window.
Great.
Back to you, Rick.
Thank you. And by the way, thank you to our sponsors. Without our sponsors, we could not do this event. So I remember back when I first started learning about Azure SQL Database, I was like, okay, one of my first questions is, how do I back up the database? And they go, you can't. I was like, what? I can't do it? They go, no, Microsoft is responsible for that. You can't do a backup of your database. So when they came out with Managed Instance, of course, one of my questions was, hey, can I do a backup? And they said, yes, you can, but we're doing backups for you anyway. But if you want to do a backup, you can. It's a copy-only backup. You can copy that to your own storage account. But it's also good to know about how are they doing the backups for me anyway. And basically, and it's changed over time, by the way, and will continue to evolve, I'm sure. But currently, from the latest information I have, is there's a weekly full backup. Every few hours, there's a differential. And every 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the workload, there is a transactional backup that's occurring. So that is why we're able to provide a financially backed SOA, for disaster recovery from backups. By default, whenever you create your managed instance, you choose what level of storage account you want to have them go to. By default, it goes to a geo-redundant storage account. For, let's say, non-production systems, you may want to change that to local redundant or zonal redundant. But for your production systems, I recommend you stay with the default with the geo restore, so you can restore that database somewhere else in case something bad happens to a region. And basically, whenever there are some ways of backing up which are not available to you in managed instance. Like you can't do a T-log backup. You can only do a copy only. You can't do piecemeal. You can't do file group. Those type of things are not available to you because that's outside the realm of what the PaaS offering is offering to you. Long-term retention, like I said, you can leverage your point-in-time restore backups for that. And I believe it is still in public preview. I don't think it's come out public preview yet, at least last time I checked. So talk about backups, DR. There's two methods for DR. One is built in with that geo-redundant storage account I talked about. So you can take the backup from your geo-redundant storage account and restore it to another managed instance in another region. And of course, the recovery time to get your database back up and running is going to be largely dependent on how big that database is. So the larger the database, the longer it's going to take to recover. The nice thing about this is you do not have to have a managed instance up and running in the other region in order to take advantage of this. But on the downside, you have to build that MI, which can take several hours at the present time, in order to get another managed instance up and running, then any networking stuff you have to do, et cetera, to get things all lined up. So if you can afford to have that downtime for DR, then great. It's already built in. You don't have to worry about that. But if you have a shorter period of time that you need to be back up and running in case of a disaster, then we have another solution for you, and that is auto failover groups. And basically, it does geo-replication of all your user databases from your production MI to your DR MI and applies those changes consistently It is asynchronous, so there is a little bit of a lag, but basically enables failover to another region. We have some listeners deployed to make it very easy and very quick to have your application. Basically, if it's pointing to your production instance, you can fail over. Well, it's still pointing to your production instance, but now in the DR's area because we do those pointer switches for you. The downside to this, of course, is that you have to have another MI running in a different region, and you're paying for that as well. So that's kind of, you have to balance out what makes sense for you and your organization. Like I said, it's all asynchronous of all databases in that MI. So you can't choose, oh, I just want these 3 databases out of these 20 to be replicated. Nope. Every single user database is being replicated over to your other managed instance. You have to have them both the same tier. For example, I can't have business critical on my production side and general purpose on my other side. It does not support that. The recovery point objective, in other words, the lag between the 2 MIs, the goal is 5 seconds. So if you do force a failover, and if you have transactions that have committed on one side but not the other, then you would lose 5 seconds of data for that. Of course, that's when you force a failover, or you have what we call an automated failover that has not fully synced all the other stuff yet. And that's what we call a grace period. That grace period can be anywhere from, well, you can have a 0 grace period, which means it doesn't fail over, you have to force it over, or anywhere from 1 to 24 hours, you can set a timer, and we will force a failover for you from production to DR. So if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you don't want to wake up your DBAs to do a failover, then you can set like a grace period of 1 hour, and within an hour, you'll be failed over to the other region. Those are just a couple things. And by the way, you can switch your tiers between business critical and general purpose. But if you're going to do that and you have failover groups already set up, you have to basically break the failover group and then go to the new tier, then establish it again. So there are some mechanics that you need to understand, what's allowable, what isn't, etc., in order to be successful at this. So here's a nice little graphic that I like. This shows, hey, I have maybe a user outside hitting an Azure traffic manager, which comes into a load balancer, and I have applications set up, and basically I have an application that does read-write, and I point to a listener that is a read-write listener that goes to in this case, my primary region on the left-hand side. And I can have application, maybe reporting app, that does reads, and I can send that to my read-only listener, which is actually looking at my managed instance in my DR region. And so if I do a switch between these, then basically the listeners switch, and so I'm pointing to the one so my listener doesn't change, but where it points to changes. And that's kind of what we show here in this graphic here. So I have instances 1 and 2 in US West, and I have instances 3 and 4 in US East. And I have a failover group called FOG1, which basically is taking instances 1 and 4 to be paired, if you will, in a fog. And if you look at the bottom here, I have fog.blah-blah-blah.database.windows.net. That's pointing to instance 1. And fog1.blah-blah-blah.secondary.database.windows.net points to instance 4. On a failover, those switch. Whatever the secondary one is will point to the one that is which is now in the role of a secondary and no longer in primary role. So your primary is always the one without the word secondary in it. So one of the nice things about this, because of, hey, I can have this DR thing, is yes, I'm paying for it, but I also get another either another node I can read from. So in general purpose, remember, I can't see that other node that's there purely for failover, but if I have a failover group assigned to it, that secondary MI in my DR region, I can now read it. So I get value out of having that MI running in the other region that I'm paying for. Same thing for business critical, except I can read both nodes in my DR region as well. So yes, I'm paying for another instance of managed instance, if you will, but I also get to read off of both the primary node, which is read-only, and my read-only node in the DR region. Because it's DR, it's read-only, no matter what designation it has. So I'm going to pause here and ask for any backup or DR questions. James, do we have anything good out there?
Well, we don't, last check, we don't have any burning questions.
Okay, sounds good. So we're going to talk about migration options. And one thing, you know, I know often whenever we do upgrades on-prem, we are usually building a new server and we're upgrading to a newer version of SQL Server and we're migrating our data over there. Same thing here, except now we're going to a versionless or evergreen flavor of SQL Server. So when we're talking about migration, you know, if you're moving to an IaaS solution with the same version of SQL Server, that's going to be a lot easier than moving to a newer version of SQL Server in IaaS or moving to managed instance, because it's also an upgrade. And there are tools that we have to help you with that. One thing to remember is, just like in on-prem, if I go from, let's say, 2016 to 2019, it's very hard for me to go back to 2016 because I can't do a backup from my 2019 database and restore it on my 2016 server. That's just not allowable. Same thing when we go to managed instance. So that means if I go to managed instance, hey, I can do a copy-only backup on my managed instance of whatever database I want, but I cannot restore that back to on-prem because it's a newer version of managed instance and it's constantly being upgraded, which also means that you are getting rid of your technical debt, because we've all been through this before with upgrades and how much pain it is because you have to go through all this process again. That stuff goes away when you move to managed instance. So whenever I'm talking with customers about migrating to managed instance, the number one thing we always look at is the database migration assistant. And if you're familiar with the old Upgrade Advisor from years past, or even the Azure Migration Wizard, it's very similar to that. So you can do an assessment of your databases. You can even give it a X-Event trace file in Database Migration Assistant to look for incompatibilities and produces an assessment report. And we'll go over some of the high-level features of that shortly. Also, the Database Migration Assistant can help you with the migration, especially of small databases. Your sources can be anything from back as far as 2005 to, of course, 2019. And you don't have to run this through a GUI, although the GUI is very nice. There's also some command, PowerShell command that you can run in order to run assessments, get SKU recommendations, and also combine a lot of the outputs all together. So it's just easier to manage and analyze. So let's talk about some of the DMA results and what my experience has been looking at these. So basically there's a couple classes, this like informational and warnings. In my experience, I haven't had informational or warning really bite me in the butt, if you know. So far, so good. I can pretty much ignore those. Behavior changes. I think there's one time I had an experience where I had behavior change on a particular join that created a little bit of havoc, not very much. But other than that one thing, behavior changes pretty much I don't have to worry about too much. Breaking changes and migration blockers is where you need to focus your attention on when you're looking at the DMA results. Usually these things are file level or OS level access. I had actually one thing that was broken because it was this was kind of a very unique combination. It was a 2008 database, but was still running in SQL Server 2000 compatibility level, and it had some of the old non-standard ANSI joins with the star equals and equal star, and so that was the only time I've had something that was non-file level or OS level really be a breaking change going forward. And you might actually have some false positives. Like, for example, if you have some third-party tools that are running like a command line type of access, and you're not going to be using those third-party tools when you go to managed instance, then you kind of ignore that. Or maybe your database has lots of revisions in it over the years, and you still have old artifacts that still have old ancient code in it. Take stock of, hey, do I really need to pay attention to the stuff that's old? So just a couple tidbits there for you. But of course, what this is trying to do is help you determine what your effort is going forward on resolving those issues. We have the database migration service is another tool to use. And this is actually going to the Azure portal, and you go to database migration service. It's a service that we run for you. It actually sets up some VMs on Azure to help you with this process, and it helps you move your databases into Azure. You can do offline migrations with database migration service. That means once you start the process, you don't have access to that database while it's migrating. We also have online continuous migration options with the database migration service. So this allows for that minimal downtime case for, on the order of 15 minutes or so, whenever you have a more critical database that you cannot afford, a downtime with when migrating. Of course, backup restore is the easiest way to migrate to a managed instance. You can take a backup from your on-prem, restore it to managed instance. That's probably the easiest path going forward. By the way, the database migration service has general purpose business critical options. That's basically in the terms of redundancy and to help you to make sure that your service doesn't stop the process, especially for very large databases. And it's project-based migration, so you can monitor that as time goes on. And there's something just announced over the past few months. If you use Azure Data Studio, which if you haven't, go ahead, download it, and try it out. Get used to it, because I think it's going to play a very big part of your future as a DBA or developer that uses SQL Server and other data sources as well. So Azure Data Studio, great tool to learn and to use, get more used to it on a basis. But Azure Data Studio has this thing called extensions, and they have this new extension called the Azure SQL Migration extension. And basically, it's tying some of these tools I just talked about into your tool, like to make it very easy for you to migrate. And you can, not only does it support migrate to Azure SQL Database and managed instance, but also helps support migrations to SQL Server on Azure VMs as well. So, and you have to provision a few things ahead of time, like Azure file shares and database migration service and integrated runtime, those type of things. You want to actually provision before you actually kick up this this extension. But basically, it helps you with your migrations. Currently, it supports online migrations only. It does not support offline migrations, but that is coming soon. And I would be neglectful if I didn't mention Azure Migrate, which is another service in Azure. And it uses some of these other tools we've talked about. But basically, it helps you assess size and migrate your workloads. And it's especially if you're running SQL Server on-prem on VMware, that is the happy path for Azure Migrate, because basically, if we get access to the vSphere metadata, which has a lot of performance data and size information about what's happening in those VMs, we can suck that into Azure Migrate and actually help that migration process speed along, so it isn't as long and drawn out as it needs to be. So just another tool in your tool bag, if you will. So we're going to jump back over to our interaction, and we come back here. So let me go here and show the voting instructions to make sure people have this again. So go to menti.com, and the code is 77796373, or you can use your phone with the QR code if you haven't already gotten there. And we're going to go on to our next interactive thing. So menti.com 77796373, or use QR code there. And I'm going to go to the next question, which is basically I want to say, hey, have you learned stuff today? Hopefully it is, and you can say, yeah. Do you understand the difference between general purpose and business critical tiers? Is that something you can strongly agree with? Then slide it on out there to the right. If not, keep it over to the left. Do you understand the migration options from on-prem to MI? Go ahead and go through, rate yourself on that. And then do you feel that general purpose can handle most of your SQL workloads? So we got some people coming in. We have 2 responses so far, 3. Keep going that up there. Okay, this is kind of cool seeing the sliders move as people vote. Keep on voting. So love to see how people jump in here and provide feedback. Great. While we're waiting for this, are there any questions, James?
The chat is quite silent. There's no any questions at this point.
I think they're over at the raffle. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's a lot of distractions. So they have, 14 presents given away. So that's a lot of distractions.
Ah, gotcha. All right, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for providing feedback here. So after 8 responses, we have 3.4, 3.9, and 3.4. So great, excellent. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to jump back to the slides here real quick. So monitoring managed instance.
Rick,
so yes.
Rick, there's a question come in just so from Michael. He want to know how can you automate these deployments?
Okay, great question. So I believe that the Terraform, there are Terraform elements that have been released now for managed instance, so you can do that. I know that there are some also additional work on Bicep for ARM deployments that are forthcoming. So that's coming in the future. Terraform will continue to be updated as well. I think I answered. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay. If not, please add. Good, great. All right. So one thing that as DBAs and folks like that, like folks like me, because I was a DBA at one time, is, hey, I wanted to see what's going on with my managed instance. How do I do that? Well, a lot of the things that you're used to doing, you can still do. DMVs, X-events, query store, DBCC commands, error logs, right? You already know a lot of that stuff that you can look at to say, hey, what's going on with my server? And there are some differences with DMVs, but most of them are very much the same. I believe Azure SQL Database has some database level ones that may not be in managed instance. I haven't checked that out recently, but that's but there's DMVs are a great source of information. Also, remember that perfmon is not available to you, but you can use sys.dm OS performance counters as a way to get at that information. Also, I think it was in the past year that the SCOM management pack for managed instance has been released. I think it was released once and they pulled it back and they finally released it again about a year ago. And I have a graphic on that, I think, on the next slide. And there are several third-party tools that can monitor managed instance as well. I know that SentryOne, now part of SolarWinds, can monitor managed instance. I believe Redgate does as well. I think Idera as well. I haven't checked on that recently, but a lot of the third-party tools know that you're moving to the cloud, so they want to make their tools cloud-friendly as well. And there's open source monitoring solutions as well, such as a combination of Telegraph, InfluxDB, and Grafana. Actually, I think, if I remember correctly, one of the hosts earlier today, Tracy Baggiano, has some sessions that she's done on that, showing how you can use the open source monitoring solution to monitor a managed instance. I don't know if there's recordings out there on that or not, but I remember watching her do that. And there's Azure native solutions as well, such as Azure SQL Analytics and Azure Monitor that I think actually Bob Ward showed off a little bit of that earlier in his session. And here's a graphic from the SCOM MI management pack. Monitors the engine, the database, space, agent jobs, memory optimized data, failover groups, authentication. So it can monitor quite a number of things for you as well. So, and this is kind of one of the exciting things I like to talk about, and that is, hey, what about my current investment in SQL Server on-prem? How does that translate when I go to managed instance? And so if your standard edition, basically it's one-to-one for general purpose. If you need to go to business critical, your standard edition does not translate into business critical. But if you have enterprise edition, which a lot of my customers do, then this is a really great solution for them. And basically, let's say they have a system on-prem with 8 enterprise edition core licenses. Okay, so they have eight of them, and if they think that general purpose will handle their workload and they want to go to the general purpose tier, then that's a 4-to-1 swap. In other words, they get 4 general purpose licenses, if you will, to that for each one that they translate over, so that 8 translates into 32. And you can split that up in any number of ways. So that means I could have 4 8 cores, I could have 2 16s, I could have 1 32. So I can break them up in a bunch of different ways. And that's for what we know, that's for the active node, right? Remember, with general purpose, you have that secondary node that's running there waiting for a failover, right? And so that is automatically part of that as well. So you get a really great swap whenever you go with Enterprise Edition to general purpose. Okay, so what about business critical? I need to have that throughput. I need to have in-memory OLTP tables, because that's what what my need is. And if I have 8 on-prem Enterprise Edition cores, it's a 1-to-1 swap. But remember, if I look at the graphic down below here, that's the green to green. That's 1-to-1 swap there. I get the yellows, the 2 yellows and the purple for free, basically, right? The 2 yellows are there for failover only, and the purple is a scale out readable node. So basically, even when you go a 1-to-1 swap, you're getting a lot more bang for your buck when you go to business critical as well. So great thing to think about and discuss with your Microsoft rep or your licensing person going forward. So I have a lot of questions come to me saying, hey, how big of an MI do I need? And there's lots of factors that go into that. And before I start into this list of things here, there is part of the database migration assistant. There's a command line tool that you can issue to go grab performance data, and it will come back and do a SKU recommendation for you. How big should it be? Does it need to be business critical? Stuff like that. So we have that information already for you. But if you don't want to go that route, some things that I kind of like to think about is, most often the SQL servers in a lot of organizations that I've dealt with over the past, 20%, even during peak workloads, is often what I see. And so do I really need to have as many cores when I go into MI? And I say, well, it depends. Because also, when you go to managed instance, for each vCore that you allocate, you get about a little over 5 gigabytes of RAM. And that's not, those two are married currently, right? So if I need to have more RAM, I need to allocate more vCores in order to get more RAM. So depending on your workload and some things we can look at there, you might be able to get away with less memory, right? If I need more memory, then I may need to increase my vCores, that type of thing. IOPS, often if they're a certain level, then you need to go to business critical. However, there are a couple of tricks you can do in general purpose tiers, such as making your database size a little bit larger to get a larger premium disk so you get more IOPS and throughput. Or you're splitting your database across multiple files to get better throughput. So there's some things you can do there that can help you get to the performance levels you need, even in general purpose. So it depends, right? And as you work with this, you're going to learn what makes sense and what doesn't. And we're almost to the end of our time, huh? So do we have any questions before? Because I was just looking at my clock. Any questions,
yes,
James?
Rick. Yes, Rick. So there's an interesting question from Dipanka. He wants to know, for our data engineering products, we got Azure SQL Server, serverless. So in your opinion, when is the time to move to managed instance?
So for Azure SQL serverless, often that means that your workload is such that it makes sense to have, not provision services all the time because you don't need them all the time running. So I would say once you get to a workload level where you need to have that responsiveness there all the time, then it would probably make more sense to move to a provisioned Azure SQL database than to managed instance, unless there's some features you need from managed instance that are not available in Azure SQL database.